Sometimes there is information in the title that you think is going to side with some conclusion that you're making, and then you just highlight the URL, Control C, and then go into the argument that you're having, Control V, and then just hit enter, and it's like, oh man, I got you now. And it's, well, wait, these results contradict your conclusion here. So what are you doing sending me this? That's happened way too many times that I can count. I would say, if you wanted to like maximally reduce the chances of falling victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect, I would say your best bet is probably just following the advice of domain experts.
I know you've got a new article out. Before we talk about the top tricks to use in debating, what are the key characteristics of someone who is a quack?
Yeah, so starting with like what constitutes a quack, I could probably just give you a brief accounting of that by reading the definition of a quack that I included in my article. A quack is a type of scientific delinquent, one who brandishes the trappings of science, yet whose scientific standards are obstinately in violation of those considered most virtuous within the contemporary philosophy of science. I was thinking very hard about what the hell a quack does that's so damn objectionable, right? And it has something to do with not following certain virtues or certain rules within a given domain or within the domain of science. So we have this domain called science, and it's based upon certain axioms or certain values. And what the quack is doing is he's just giving those axioms a big middle finger. And that's what he's doing that's so objectionable. So you can identify a quack by kind of appraising their claims and seeing how well those claims are in accord with the theoretical virtues within the philosophy of science. If they're like strangely discordant with those virtues, they're a quack. But if their claims are in accord with those virtues, they're probably not a quack, right? So that's a pretty reliable litmus test as far as I'm concerned for telling whether or not somebody is a quack. And the kind of article that you're talking about lays out a procedure for how to identify these people, the kinds of claims that they make that would qualify them as being more virtuous or less virtuous. And I give a list of the actual scientific or theoretical virtues. And it's like, okay, more compatible with this, less quacky, less compatible with this, more quacky. So that's the basic short and skinny of how to identify a quack.
If you're speaking with someone, what things would you do to identify it? Yeah,
so let's say somebody comes up to me with a hypothesis. I actually list a bunch of them here. Let's say somebody says, refined carbohydrates cause obesity, right? Say this is just a claim that somebody comes at me with. I would just ask them what the evidence is, right? And maybe they would render some evidence. And if they really knew what they were saying, if they really knew like what they were talking about, they should be able to tell me why that evidence is more expected on that hypothesis rather than that hypothesis negation, right? So the negation of that hypothesis is refined carbohydrates do not cause obesity. So they would need to be able to tell me why the evidence that they're bringing to me is more expected on that hypothesis rather than its negation. And even if I just formulated another hypothesis on the spot that made the same prediction but was mutually incompatible with their hypothesis, they should be able to tell me why the evidence is more expected on their hypothesis. So that question, like first ask for the evidence and then ask why the evidence is more expected on that hypothesis rather than its negation. And if you don't get a good answer to that question, you're probably dealing with a quack, right? Because if they understood what they were talking about, if they really had good scientific epistemic chops, they'd be able to answer that question and they'd be able to give you a convincing answer to that question.
Do you have any examples of what they might say?
Yeah, I can give you a really clear example. So I had a debate with somebody named Alexa. It was a 3-hour debate. It was very civil. We had a second debate that was less civil because they weren't tracking and it was just very frustrating. But in this first debate that we had, he said the proposition was that a carnivore diet is the best diet for human health, right? And assuming that that's intelligible to begin with, he said his evidence for this was that, well, the agricultural revolution decreased our brain size by 11%, right? And I said to him, well, listen, maybe the agricultural revolution actually increased the efficiency of our brain such that it was able to do the same amount of work with less tissue, or even more work with less tissue. So that's my alternative hypothesis. Show me how your evidence is more expected on your hypothesis than mine. And he just wasn't able to do it, right? Because it's such a weird thing to say. Like, a carnivore diet is the best diet for human health because the agricultural revolution decreased our brain size by 11%. It's like, okay, great. Maybe that's actually a good thing. So explain to me why that isn't a good thing. And usually when you get into a situation like that and they're not able to actually fully unpack it to you, like why their evidence is more expected on their hypothesis, you know you're dealing with somebody who just doesn't know what they're talking about.
So they'll need to provide some evidence that processed foods reduce the size of the brain, and that led us to being less intelligent.
Yeah, something negative, or because, see, this is what I do in debates with these people now, is I actually just grant them their evidence. I don't care about bringing the veracity of the evidence into question. Like, if somebody says, okay, the agricultural revolution decreased our brain size by 11%, I don't ask for a study for that. I just grant it to them. It's like, okay, cool. I'm just taking you at your word that this is true. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with an alternative hypothesis that makes the same prediction, but it's mutually incompatible with your hypothesis. And I'm just going to watch you struggle to figure out how to tell me why your hypothesis is more theoretically virtuous than mine. And that is a really good way of getting under a quack, because you're bringing them down to like an epistemic layer that they are very uncomfortable existing in. So, like, you start off with the layer of philosophy, like basically it's all philosophy, but then you have on top of that epistemology, and then you have the philosophy of science, then you have scientific epistemology, and then you have science, which is the application of the philosophy of science and scientific epistemology. And then you have studies and study design, and that's like the level of information. Now, I'm dragging them down to the level of epistemology, not the level of information. They want to mess around kicking studies back and forth and using studies like cards in a Magic the Gathering deck. No, I'm not interested in that at all. I'm going to drag them down to the epistemic layer where they have absolutely no idea what's going on. And anybody who knows what they're talking about with science knows how to operate on that level. So if you drag them down to that level and they flounder, you just know you're dealing with a quack. Just in virtue of the fact that they can't operate on that level, you know you're dealing with a quack. So it's a really, really powerful way to identify the type of person you're dealing with, whether it's a quack or not.
And how would a true scientist behave from the foundational epistemic layer that you're talking about?
Yeah, so when we're considering whether or not a hypothesis is viable and competitive, like, a scientist would evaluate whether or not that hypothesis is more theoretically virtuous than the alternative, right? And there are certain theoretical virtues or axioms in science that science is just based upon. When you say the word science, you're invoking these concepts whether you know it or not. And basically, there are 5 theoretical virtues. One's immovable. It has to apply, and that's testability. A hypothesis has to be testable if it's a scientific hypothesis. It has to be fruitful. So all things being equal, a hypothesis that's more fruitful is the one that's to be favored. And fruitfulness just means that it makes novel predictions. You should be able to make a prediction, go out into the world and observe it, right? So that's the fruitfulness of a hypothesis. Then you have the scope of a hypothesis. How many phenomena does the hypothesis account for? All things being equal, the hypothesis that accounts for the most phenomena is to be favored. Then you have parsimony, the hypothesis that makes the fewest predictions, or not fewest predictions, fewest assumptions. The hypothesis that makes the fewest assumptions should be favored, all things equal. And then the last, which is the most expendable of the virtues, is conservatism, which is, all things being equal, the hypothesis that is most compatible with our background knowledge and understanding and intuitions is to be favored. That's the most expendable out of all of them because it's the least kind of objective, I guess you could say. Now, a scientist is aware of this, like a good scientist is aware of this, and when they're evaluating one hypothesis over the other, they know whether or not one hypothesis will be making more novel predictions than the other, whether or not it accounts for a wider scope of phenomena, whether or not it's more parsimonious. Parsimony is very easy to identify, like right off the hop. When somebody gives you a hypothesis, it's very easy to identify whether or not it's not being parsimonious. For example, vegetable oils cause heart disease. It sounds like it's very parsimonious because it's like, it's just this one variable. Like, look at how many assumptions we don't have to make. It's just one little variable and it's causing all this whole catastrophe. And it's like so few assumptions we have to make. And it's like, well, not really, because you have to bootstrap up a lot of assumptions if that's going to be your hypothesis, because you're completely failing on scope. Listen, none of the previously observed phenomena are compatible with that hypothesis. And you're completely failing on fruitfulness because it's not clear that that the hypothesis makes any novel predictions. So it ends up not being very parsimonious because you have to create like kind of auxiliary just so stories in order to make it, in order to like justify it as a hypothesis. It's like, oh no, it's like, well, the way we deal with the fact that all of the current observations aren't expected on this hypothesis is that all methods of making those observations are crap. So somebody might say, oh, epidemiology is garbage, and that's why this hypothesis works. Well, why is epidemiology garbage? That just seems like you're baking on more assumptions, right? So the parsimony gets more and more problematic the more you start teasing the hypothesis apart. This is the kind of stuff that scientists do when they're appraising scientific hypotheses and when they're weighing up one hypothesis over the other. And you can separate quacks from good scientists just by seeing how they interact with hypotheses like this. If they're not interacting with it in the ways that I'm kind of describing, it should be at least setting off alarm bells or like raising red flags in your head that this person might not know what they're talking about.
Having debates with all of these people, it must be quite frustrating sometimes. Have you ever, in the heat of the moment, lost your cool or said something you regret in hindsight?
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe not anything I regret. I mean, there was one debate that I wasn't particularly proud of because this guy was making such a weird claim, and I'm not even sure if it was a claim because he wasn't able to actually give me any definitions for the terms in the utterance he was making, so I don't even know if it qualifies as a claim. It seemed like it was just gibberish. He said, you can't infer causality from epidemiological studies. And then I just asked him, what do you mean by can't? Right? And he couldn't tell me what he meant by can't. So, like, in philosophy or logic, a term like can't is what we call a modal term. And can't can be understood through a wide variety of modalities. Right? So like you could have a physical modality. So if something can't happen on a physical modality, it just means that it's going to violate some law of nature. If something can't happen on a logical modality, it just means that it's going to entail a contradiction. If something can't happen on a technological modality, it just means we don't have the technology for it. Or any of those modalities will work. He just couldn't tell me which modality he meant, right? When he said can't, he just said, what I mean by can't is that it couldn't be. It's like, okay, well, what do you mean by it couldn't be? I mean, it can't. It's like, what are you even saying? And by the end of it, it was just gibberish, right? So this was like a 26-minute conversation that happened at the ass end of a 3-hour debate that I was moderating. And I was really frustrated with this guy, and I just kind of like laid into him, and I was like, okay, you're going to tell me right now what you mean by can't, because I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And I mean, by the end of it, he couldn't unpack it, and he ended up just leaving the call. And I don't know what to do with those people when they actually don't know how to explain themselves. Like, they don't have the words to describe the concepts in their head, or I don't know what's going on, but they're certainly making claims that they can't even provide any intelligible justification for. And it's okay, like, you can't infer causality from epidemiological studies. Like, what the hell do you mean by can't? Because it's clearly false. It's clearly false. Listen, I have an epidemiological study in front of me. It shows a certain effect. I'm inferring causality. I think it's causal. I'm inferring that it's causal. There, that straightforwardly makes the claim false if he's trying to say something like physical impossibility, right? Or he physically can't be. So, yeah, I'm going off on a rant here, but that was an extremely frustrating conversation. So the answer to your question is yes. I've gotten very kind of frustrated with people and kind of yelled at them before it happens.
Yeah, that's a strange one. So a study could be an RCT, which is part of epidemiology, right?
Well, usually people like kind of they kind of categorize studies. So you have experimental studies, you have all sorts of experimental designs, and then you have like epidemiological studies or so-called observational studies on the other hand. And usually people don't think of experimental studies as belonging to observational studies, and people don't think of observational studies as belonging to experimental studies. When you dig deep enough, you can see that the lines are a little blurred, but generally speaking, they're two separate things. Yeah.
So this guy, he wasn't talking about just ecological association as we were talking earlier, for example, with smoking.
Yeah, he was just talking about epidemiology more broadly. So that would include things like ecological associations, Mendelian randomization, prospective cohort studies, case control studies, retrospective studies, cross-sectional studies, that whole bucket of epidemiological studies. Can't infer causality with any of it. And where can't is meaning something unintelligible. So he might as well have been saying, just to highlight this, just to put the point on it, he might as well have been saying that you flub a Lorcan from epidemiological studies. Right? It's just gibberish. I don't know what the hell that means. Like you can't flub a Lorcan causality, or you flub a Lorcan a causal inference from epidemiological studies. Yeah, just replacing that one word with just gibberish. That's what I heard when he was talking, because he couldn't unpack it to me. It's like you can't, where can't means nothing. Great. It just didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, we all eat, and so everyone thinks they know a lot about nutrition. And when you first look at nutrition, everything looks the same, so it's easy to fall for misinformation because you don't know what's true, what's false. So do you have any tips for people to avoid the Dunning-Kruger effect? So sometimes a lot of people, they're acting in good faith, but they're just overestimating their intelligence. How can someone avoid that?
I would say, if you wanted to like maximally reduce the chances of falling victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect, I would say your best bet is probably just following the advice of domain experts. So following the advice of people who are experts in nutrition. So if you wanted personalized nutrition advice, go to a dietitian. They're going to know more about nutrition than you, almost guaranteed. You go to a clinical dietitian, Jesus Christ, those people are machines. Like, the amount of knowledge they have is absolutely insane. Yeah, I would say just trust the experts. If you really, while you're building up your own knowledge, always default to the expert opinion while you're building up your own knowledge. I think that's probably the best advice that I could give to somebody who really wants to like minimize the chances of falling victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
I agree. The problem is a lot of these experts, they don't have the time to be in social media. They're in their clinics. Do you have a few good people who you would recommend to follow rather than focus on the charlatans and quacks? Let's maybe give a few people who you personally like that more evidence-based. Yeah,
so there are a few people. Gil Carvalho, he's the guy who runs Nutrition Made Simple on YouTube. His channel is actually really, really good. And I have never heard him say anything about nutrition that was like outlandish or weird or inaccurate. He's really solid. Another one is Alan Flanagan at Alinea Nutrition. He's another one who's really good. I've never really heard him make a nutrition-related claim that was outlandish, weird, or unsubstantiated. His kind of partner in crime, Danny Lennon, is also really good. And some kind of accessory folks that are also really good would be like Simon Hill from The Proof, and what's the other one? Yeah, Layne Norton is usually pretty good as well. Although he uses causal language in really weird ways, but altogether I think Layne Norton's pretty good. And although he doesn't make a lot of like nutrition content, he's generally available to like take random questions. There's actually two people who fall into this bucket. On Twitter, Avi Bitterman is one of them, and the other is Matt Madore is another one. They are really sharp on nutrition and generally are cool just answering questions on the fly. So I don't want to speak for them. Like, I don't want them to get like inundated with messages now, but they're usually pretty cool about engaging with people.
I will follow them as well. Yeah, Danny Lennon, he's got a good podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio, which I'm a big fan of. And then Gil, I had on the podcast a few weeks ago where we talked about heart disease. If you could design any study, what would you design if time and money was no issue?
Okay, like one study that I could design. Yeah, you know, I have absolutely no idea. I have so many kind of research questions that I'd like definitive answers to. Like you're kind of saying like the Candyland study where money isn't a problem and you can kind of get like whatever you want out of it. I guess I would really like to see another one of those really big dietary fat studies, but with multiple arms. Like I really just want to get to the bottom of this thing. So I would have 3 arms, or at least 3 arms plus a control, and maybe one other group for flavor, just for the vegans. So you'd have like a high polyunsaturated fat, high monounsaturated fat, high saturated fat group, then a control group, and then maybe a separate group that's, or maybe the control group can just be like high carb or something like that, or replacing all of the fatty acids with something else. And then just see what happens to heart disease risk. I just want to see another one of these really big dietary fat studies, and actually done with like modern techniques and modern technology. I think that would be really funny because we all know what it's going to show, but I would just, my motivations for answering this question this way is like really, really selfish, because I just want to be able to take that study and dunk on people, like basically. So, yeah.
That's funny because Gil Carvalho, he answered us a similar way as well. He said a more comprehensive metabolic board study. What do you say to people that don't trust any nutritional research because they believe corporate interests clash with improving health?
Just ask them what the argument for that is. I mean, it's such that one thing isn't. I don't think financial interests. Like, I don't think it's entailed from financial interest that studies are going to be like methodologically compromised or anything like that. So I just need like an argument before I was going to buy anything about that.
Because on social media, I see people say, "Oh, this study's funded by the egg industry.
Yeah,
every study's funded by everyone. You can't believe anything."
Yeah, I mean, if we're really going to operate like that, then I guess throw medicine out the window. I don't know what to tell you. Like, the entailments of that are just like really bizarre. If you don't trust any study on the basis of funding, you end up just taking medicine and just throwing it in the trash. And I'm not prepared to do that.
Do you always look at the clash of interests when you read the paper? Is this something you pay attention to?
It's one of the last things I look at, because even before I get to that section of the paper, if there are any methodological errors that are obvious, or any like inferential errors, or any errors in the results, like, they're going to be made manifest before I even get to the end of the paper where the conflicts of interest stuff are. So rather than just going to the like straight to the conflicts of interest part and then just inferring that the study's compromised or unreliable, I actually try to verify for myself whether or not the study has any methodological issues, or issues with the, statistical analysis, or any issues with the actual conclusions of the study. I don't generally read the conclusions of a study either. Like the kind of intro and the discussion, I very rarely read those, right? usually just go in, look at the methodology, and then look at the results, and then form my own conclusions. But I even more rare than reading the intro and the discussion is me reading the conflicts of interest section, because it is so ridiculously uninteresting to me where the money came from for the study.
I think that's a good tip, because so little people read the methods. They read the abstract or the conclusion.
Yeah, or they just don't even read the abstract. They just read the title, and then that's good enough. Because sometimes there is information in the title that you think is going to, like, you know, side with some conclusion that you're making, and then you just highlight the URL, Control C, and then go into the argument that you're having, Control V, and then just hit enter, and it's like, oh man, I got you now. And it's, well, wait, these results contradict your conclusion here. So what are you doing sending me this? That's happened way too many times that I can count.
And what is your favorite book, Nick?
Favorite book?
The book that had the greatest influence on your life?
I've never been much of a reader. I'm just trying to look at my bookshelf over here to kind of try to come up with a book that had the book that had the greatest influence on my life is probably On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee, because it's like really practical. It teaches you, rather than teaching you recipes about, you know, how to make this, that, or the next thing, it just tells you about fundamental chemical properties of different foods and how they react to different, you know, kind of inputs, heat application methods, and all of that. It's closer to a chemistry textbook than a cooking textbook or anything like that. But what it does is, instead of just teaching you recipes and having you follow them blindly, it teaches you the skill set that you need to know in order to understand how ingredients act with one another, so that you can actually just cook without a recipe, and you can just intuitively understand how something's going to turn out even before you start making it. That's a really, really, really good book. I would highly recommend it. It's super solid for anybody who's into cooking.
So it's like how to, for example, balance out the taste. If something's too bitter, add something sweet, or toasting spices to get the flavor out. Is it based on these sort of principles?
It's even more kind of, it's even stranger than that. Like, they have a section that goes over the different kinds of crystallization processes for starch, so that you can understand how starch behaves at different temperatures. So you would know, hey, like, if I get over this temperature with, say, a potato, the texture is going to be like gluey and sticky because the starch is releasing from the cells. But if I cook the potato at this temperature, allow the starch granules to expand and gelatinize, I think they call it, and then cool them, I'm going to have these big starch globules instead of these little starch globules, and now I can cook it at that higher temperature, and it's not going to be gluey. Because those starch granules are, even though the cells are like rupturing and popping, those starch granules are not going to get out, and they're not going to make everything all sticky. Like, those are the kinds of things that the book teaches you about, like little, like, kind of biochemical and chemistry related things.
Interesting. I've read that it's better to wash starch under cold temperature, because under hot water it stays gooey, and when you add cold water it hardens, so it's easier to wash the dishes.
That is true. I believe that's true.
What is the meaning of life, according to Nick Hiebert?
This is going to sound really lame, but I don't know what the question's asking. Like, the meaning of life, like, is that like the meaning of the word life? Because I can give you a definition of the word life, but the meaning of life isn't something that I would describe like a meaning to, because I take a meaning to be like something definitional. Like, this is the meaning for like this concept or like this word. Meaning isn't really something that I use to talk about like platonic objects, you know. Like, the meaning, it's like asking, like, what is the meaning of a chair? Well, I don't take a chair to have a meaning. I take the word chair to have a meaning, but I don't take a chair to have a meaning. So much the same way I don't take life to have a meaning. I don't mean to sound like a jerk. I don't think the question's intelligible.
I'll rephrase it. Why are we here? Is there any reason?
Any reason? So if by reason you mean like there's some explanation for us being here, like, yeah, I mean, I would say that's we're here due to Darwinian evolution and natural selection.
Okay.
I'm giving you very unsatisfying answers. I'm so sorry.
Now I know what the people debating you feel, so that's good. So maybe what gives you drive in life? What gives you energy? What motivates you?
Satisfying my preferences. It's another unsatisfying answer.
What are your preferences?
Too many to list. I mean, they're innumerable. I have dietary preferences. I have literary preferences. I have, all sorts of preferences. Probably too many for me to list, but I know satisfying them is what gives me joy.
So maximize satisfaction.
Yeah.
Do you have a book coming out soon?
No, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of writing a book because, especially one that's going to be like made into hard copies, because it would give me a lot of anxiety to have my thoughts on paper in a way that was like immutable. It's like, oh, I can't go back and edit this. That really sucks. Like, I got that wrong. And it's not only wrong, it's really wrong. Like, oh my God, that kind of stuff would give me a lot of anxiety. So I don't think I'll ever write a book. At least not something that isn't an ebook. An ebook, I could at least go back and edit.
That's a shame, because I thought you were writing a book. I saw a few videos where you had some sort of document.
I was going to release it as an ebook, and then I accidentally deleted it when I was doing, when I was cleaning up my Google documents. I accidentally nuked it. Now, luckily, most of what was there is already on my blog. There was just some other stuff there that wasn't on my blog, and, well, it's, it's gone now. I don't know how to get it back.
That's a big shame.
Yeah.
How long does an article take you to write? For example, the rebuttal article?
That one took about 3 or 4 months to write. I mean, the whole article was close to 30 to 40,000 words. But what went up on the website was closer to like 15 to 20,000 words. Because apparently my blog widget on my website gets very upset with me when I try to publish an entire blog or like an entire book to my blog. It's like, no, you just can't do that. Like, you can't publish an entire book to your blog. That's insane. So I had to pick and choose which things were most important and which things were going to make it, which things weren't. So there are a whole bunch of other endpoints that just had like very short kind of descriptions, like just basically saying, I couldn't find any data on this. There were like 5 different endpoints that basically had that going on. It's like, there's just like no data on this research question. And those are the ones that kind of got axed. And I think all of the stuff that's really important is there.
How many hours a day was it? 3 months.
Yeah, for that one, I don't know, probably anywhere between 8 and 14. Like from Monday to Friday. Monday to Friday, so like say 5 days a week, 8 o'clock to, or not 8 o'clock, but 8 hours to like 12 or 14 hours. It was a slog. Like, it was just writing, researching, because most of it is not actually writing. It's aggregating data, looking through studies, doing abstract screening, doing full text screening and stuff like that. And it just takes a lot of time.
Crazy, because you're getting no financial benefit for writing this. And so you're just writing for 3 months.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have like the support of all of my patrons and followers and stuff like that. And while I was doing it, I was just thinking to myself, like, this is kind of what I'm getting paid to do. Just sit here and research things. So I didn't really think of it as like doing it for free. People pay me to produce content, and that's what I was doing. So it's not like I was like foregoing income while I was doing it. For me, it was more or less just like fulfilling an obligation to these people who are paying me to do things exactly like that. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out.
So that's probably the best way to support you then through your Patreon, if people are listening.
Yeah, what I've been telling people these days is it really depends on who you want to pay. So you could support me by becoming like a member on my YouTube channel, but YouTube takes about 30% for themselves. So if you want to pay me and YouTube, by all means, become a YouTube member. Similarly with Patreon, if you want to pay Patreon as well, they take about 5% themselves. So if you want to pay me and Patreon, by all means, go to Patreon. But if you want to pay me and only me, I have also in my social media links that are on my Twitter and on any one of my YouTube videos, I also have a link to my LiberaPay. LiberaPay doesn't take any money for themselves. The way they support themselves is by creating a creator page on their own patron site. So they're supported through crowdfunding just like everybody else on the site. So they have a really good business model here because they actually they don't take any money for themselves. Like I support LiberaPay. I'm a patron on their page because I feel obligated to pay it forward because they have such a good platform. But yeah, if you want to pay me and nobody but me, LiberaPay. If you want to pay me and somebody else, the two other options are fine too.
Okay, great. And do you have any upcoming projects? What's next in line?
Next in line, I am currently working on doing some... So I recently got in touch with somebody who's going to do some video work for me. They're going to create some video clips that I'm going to use to create some snazzy YouTube videos. And I'm actually going to start creating good video content, not just me hitting the record button, talking for 20 minutes, and then hitting the record button again, actually editing them properly with decent transitions and an intro and an outro and all of that cool stuff. So the next big project for me, I'm leaving everything else aside and I'm just focusing on making video content because my followers have made themselves like loud and clear that that's what they want me to do, and they're paying me and I'll be their dancing monkey. I don't care. So I'm going to be making video content in the near future.
Will we see you on Instagram as well, making reels and clips?
Probably not. My Instagram, I think, is getting nuked in about 25 days because I deleted my Facebook, and I didn't know that when you delete your Facebook, Instagram goes with it. So, yeah, Instagram's going to get nuked in like 25 days or so. I didn't really use Instagram for a lot, and it's my least favorite platform out of all of them. I want to really condense my social media presence down into some core places so I'm not spreading myself too thin. Like pretty much just Twitter, Mastodon, and YouTube, and Discord. That's it. And I'm happy with that.
Well, it was great to speak with you. Hopefully people feel a lot more comfortable having vegetable oils, and hopefully they don't fall for the Hong Kong argument anymore as well.
Yeah, for sure. No, it was great chatting with you, man. Thanks for having me. Take care, man.
Highly enjoyable. Yep, take care. Ciao.
Catch you later.
Thanks a lot for tuning in. You can support Foolproof Mastery in a number of ways. First of all, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a review on Apple Podcasts with an honest opinion of what you think. Leave plenty of comments on YouTube and share with your friends, family and colleagues if you feel that you have learned something new in order to keep on getting the knowledge out to as many people as possible. Finally, keep on living every day to the maximum and see you next time for another episode. Ciao.